At its very core, drug science must remain independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. It's with the support of the drug science community we're able to do this and make the podcast in the first place. If you're able to become a drug science community member and support the show, you too will be supporting the dissemination of evidence-based drug policies. Without you, none of this would be possible. For anybody interested, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Here we're bringing together experts and activists for a rational, honest and informed conversation about drugs.
Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, Jo Neal, and Dr. Hannah Thurger. Now today our guest is a distinguished professor at a top UK university, Ravi Das. Now, avid listeners might remember Ravi was part of our Street Drugs discussions event on the psychopharmacology of ketamine. So Ravi is a professor of psychopharmacology at UCL, and he trained there. He co-directs the UCL Clinical Psychopharmacology Unit, the CPU, and his research aims to develop next generation, more effective treatments for substance use, eating and stress disorders. And we'll be talking all about that on the podcast. So Ravi, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about yourself and your academic career?
Sure, yeah. So my name's Ravi. I've been at UCL for pretty much my entire career, actually. Basically part of the furniture there now. But I was very fortunate to have amazing supervisors as an undergraduate for my kind of final year project in people who might be familiar to their podcast, so Celia Morgan and Al Curran. And I just kind of found my place there, really, and got really interested in drugs research and addictions particularly. And that kind of led into a PhD, which was supervised by Sanjeev Kamboj, who I still work with now at UCL almost 15 years later.
That's great.
So it's been a while.
So pretty happy time at UCL then.
It is, yeah. It seemed like a good place. And, you know, when we started, it was one of the few places that you could do the kind of research that we wanted to do, which was looking at the kind of repurposing of Schedule I drugs to see whether they might have therapeutic effects. And also just looking at kind of harms in recreational users. And, you know, you need certain licenses to be able to do that research. And they are few and far between, or very much were back in those days. And yeah, that was one of the few places that we could actually get the research done.
Yeah. Those licenses are still few and far between, or they take years or 6 months to a year to get one.
And I know.
And hell. Something, bureaucratic hell, something we're trying to get changed, all of us really. So, you know, in your sort of early life, your school years, did you always think you were going to work on the brain and psychiatric disorders?
Honestly, no. Yeah, I wanted to be a shipbuilder.
Great.
I thought that would have been a nice job, build ships. Yeah, it wasn't necessarily by design. I think it was more kind of happy accident, really. You know, these little things that you choose can determine your course in ways that you don't really foresee until you have the benefit of hindsight, right?
Yeah.
So choosing psychology at UCL obviously sent me down a path that I've stayed on. And if I'd not, you know, had the benefit of having such great supervisors at the end of that course, because really I didn't actually like that much of the course up until that point.
Yeah.
I probably would have ended up doing something else, but I don't know. I've never been particularly financially motivated, which is useful as an academic. Yeah. It's kind of the key trait that you need, actually.
Yeah.
And, you know, I've always wanted to do, you know, whether real or perceived, you know, make some kind of positive contribution to, you know, health and well-being, I suppose. Didn't go down an actual clinical route of becoming a doctor or a therapist. So that kind of left academia and kind of clinically applied science. And I've always had that intellectual curiosity. I think there's a lot to be learned, and learning itself is very much a motivator for me. And, you know, it's great to be self-directed and to be able to pursue avenues that you otherwise might not have the independence to do.
And I think having those early mentors sort of early on in your career and Kisu is really important aspect of where your career goes, really.
Absolutely. Yeah. I know some people can have not necessarily toxic, but quite unpleasant
Yeah.
experiences during their postgraduate research. And I think that puts people off. Like, there's definitely a brain drain from PhD to postdoctoral research. And that might be financial, or it might just be that a lot of people have quite difficult experiences during their PhD. So having those good teachers, those good mentors is key, yeah.
And actually, Ravi, I think one thing people don't really appreciate is how hard it is to do a PhD. You go through all the different phases.
Absolutely. Yeah. No one really prepares you for it.
No.
You can be told those final years. I don't know anyone who's just kind of breezed through their final year of
No.
a PhD.
It's brutal. It's really brutal. But really tells you whether you're going to have a career in research or not, I think.
Yeah, because a lot of it is like that.
Yeah.
I think you have to be able to be quite resilient, and know that there are going to be ups and downs, and take the good with the bad. Because it can often be a bit of a slog getting through a study, but then if you keep the bigger picture in sight, I think that's pretty key.
It is, yes, having that ultimate goal and the bigger picture. So a lot of your work now focuses on addiction. Would you like to tell our listeners a little bit about addiction and addiction processes, but in particular, and I know Hannah is very keen to discuss this with you, the sort of memory consolidation and reconsolidation aspects?
Yeah, sure. That's kind of my niche, really, is uniting memory research with addictions and seeing how memory is implicated in addiction. So, I mean, there are lots of treatments that are available for addictions, substance use disorders or behavioral addictions currently. But a lot of them don't work that well for a large proportion of people, or at least relapse rates tend to be very high after people complete treatment. And so looking at kind of the basic science of what occurs when people start forming addictive behaviors, a lot of the basic research is based around learning. So, people don't tend to be born addicted to anything, except in very rare cases. And so that, there has to be this acquisition of something that's causing the addiction, right? And that tends to be exposure. So it's fairly unique in addictions that there has to be something to be addicted to, right? If you removed someone from their environment where there was the availability of drugs, even if they had the highest propensity towards addiction possible, they wouldn't be able to kind of enact their addiction, which is not the same as, someone could be depressed on a desert island quite easily.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And so we looked like, what are the environmental triggers that cause people to want to take drugs? And these are kind of learned associations, we think, between things that just tend to happen to be around in the environment that are predictive of the availability of drugs. So people with addictions won't just use drugs randomly. They'll tend to be in certain locations and contexts at certain times and in response to certain things. And those kind of associations are learned during kind of repeated drug use. So people learn to associate certain things in their environment with the rewarding effects of a drug, so that when they kind of re-encounter those cues in the environment, they can spark off those motivational processes that can be felt as craving and like a motivated desire to use drugs, and kind of preoccupation with using. And so with the memory piece, we wanted to find ways that we could kind of break down those associations, to kind of break that link in the chain, so that people don't have those responses to their environments. And that's where this process of reconsolidation comes in, which is very much grounded in kind of molecular neuroscience and animal work. And we're kind of focused on trying to translate that to human clinical applications.
Could you give us an example?
Yeah, for sure. So the idea is if you reactivate memories, which you can do by kind of showing the cues that you're trying to target, the associations that you're trying to target, you can use drugs or different kind of behavioral interventions during this period when the memory is unstable. So during reconsolidation, a memory will become unstable in order to kind of update or strengthen. And then you've got this brief window where you can intervene. And certain drugs, like NMDA receptor antagonists like ketamine, can interfere with that process. I mean, the drugs that they tend to use in animals tend to be quite nasty, like protein synthesis inhibitors. So not things that you'd use in humans. So like the possibilities for human drug intervention are fewer, but they're there, and we've shown that they work. So a few years ago, we did a study with hazardous, harmful drinkers, and we got them in to the labs at UCL or UCLH and tried to reactivate their reward memories surrounding alcohol. And that basically involves showing them pictures of preferred drinks and like an actual kind of sample of a preferred drink kind of briefly. And that the idea of that is to kind of engage that memory destabilization process. And then we gave them ketamine or placebo. And the idea, it's just a one-off intervention. That's kind of what's unique about it. You don't have to go through an 8-week course of therapy.
Yeah, because extinction therapy or something would take a long time.
Exactly, yeah. And the other problem with extinction or like exposure-based therapies, they don't actually break down existing memories. They create new inhibitory memories. So if you imagine you've learned this new association, which is not having the drug when you're doing extinction training, but the old one is that the Q drug association is still there. And so when you go back out into the wild, it's kind of under the surface, ready to reemerge. And that's what happens. And that's what you see with exposure therapy. It loses efficacy after a while.
And so what is it that's unique about ketamine, do you think, from your study that helps break down those memories in contrast to the exposure-based methods?
Yeah, I mean, the ketamine itself we only used because of its pharmacology, really. So to block the NMDA receptor, which is kind of the centrally implicated receptor in a lot of associative memory processes and synaptic plasticity. So we know that activation of that receptor is necessary to restabilize memories from the animal work. And ketamine's one of the kind of the most available and best drugs that we have in humans to achieve that. That was the main motivation, really. And then obviously there's, since and kind of around the same time, there's been this emergent data that ketamine itself might have this kind of anti-addictive potential, particularly in opiate and alcohol use disorders. So the work that Celia Morgan's doing at Exeter and Elias Takwa in Columbia. So, I mean, in that study that we had a specific group where we gave people just ketamine without this memory reactivation procedure, because we knew, that would help, and we needed a baseline against that. And we found that with the memory reactivation procedure before the ketamine, you got this boosting. So people kind of wanted to drink less afterwards and liked alcohol less and actually drank less in terms of their reduction up to 9 months later.
Oh, that's a long, and that's one dose of ketamine, isn't it?
Yeah, so the actual intervention part of this was, half an hour of intervention. So in terms of kind of cost benefit or like time in and potential benefit, it's a bit of a winner, particularly if thinking about the difficulty in the NHS currently with the staff availability. It's quite attractive from that standpoint.
And so would this model maybe be used in what type of addictions do you think, compared to the kind of Celia Morgan's model where it's ketamine combined with therapy? Would it be maybe just more hazardous drinking or kind of harmful drinking rather than really entrenched alcohol use disorder?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the evidence shows that more entrenched memories are more difficult to destabilize, but it might be possible to overcome that by carefully designing the way you reactivate them. So we don't know what the upper limit is actually in humans, because not that much research has been done using this exact kind of approach. But certainly there have been studies trying to use the same mechanism, so this reconsolidation mechanism, in cocaine use disorder and opiate use disorders that have shown similar effects in actual, quite severe clinical populations. So it seems like it should work in the more severely addicted populations as well. But we haven't tested it.
That is extraordinary, isn't it? Because there's really nothing out there that is likely to work.
That's right, yeah. It's a particularly tricky one. And that's why, I don't know, it's kind of want to be optimistic about the future of treatments, but they haven't progressed massively in a long time now. And so we're desperately overdue some better treatments.
Yeah, better treatments and a more understanding of the mechanisms, which is why these studies are so important, to really understand how the drugs actually work in different conditions as well.
Yeah, I think so. It's, it can be tempting to just put the drug first and not really think about how it works, just kind of give the drug and look at the outcomes. But I think that often leads to a bit of a dead end with translational psychiatry, particularly because, when it doesn't work, we don't really understand why it's not working for some people.
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
And then what's the maladaptive memory process like in PTSD then in comparison to addictions? Are there core differences, or what kind does the research show there?
Yeah, so the big difference with PTSD, so one of the core symptoms of PTSD is intrusive memories or re-experiencing of traumatic events. And those are kind of ingrained in memory. And so, you can use the same approach, if you can break down those memories of a traumatic event, for instance, or stop them being so deeply embedded and emotionally embedded. Can you reduce kind of re-experiencing? Can you reduce symptomatology? The difference is that people who have undergone a traumatic event, assuming it is a single event, like I'm not, complex PTSD is another thing. You have a kind of autobiographical memory that you would need to kind of individualize the memory reactivation for. And people have tried this. There are quite a few clinical trials using a drug called propranolol, which is a beta blocker in the same context, or doing actual kind of exposure therapy, but within this window when the memory is unstable. The idea being that if you do it then it kind of updates the fear, the trauma memory, rather than just creating a new trace. And so that's much more robust against the re-emergence of the fear.
So in terms of then psychedelics, there's the BEMA study, isn't there, with MDMA for alcohol use disorder. And then there's been quite a lot of work with other psychedelics. So that's quite a different process, is it, to the work that you're doing?
That's a big question, Jo.
Oh, sorry. Just because I don't understand it.
I think lots of people have a lot of different ideas about how psychedelics work in addictions. Depending on the kind of philosophical camp that they come from, I suppose, people tend to have a more psychotherapeutic view or a more biological view.
Mm-hmm.
And it's likely from, in my opinion, that it's a combination of both factors that are important. And so there's this idea that psychedelics can enhance therapy, and the exact way that people will say that occurs, they'll either appeal to kind of neural mechanisms, so neuroplasticity, being enhanced by psychedelics, meaning that the therapy kind of sticks, I guess, more, or that, to more psychological mechanisms, like, it makes people more open to new experiences, makes them more cognitively flexible, makes them more potentially suggestible during therapy. And yeah, it could well be both of those things. But I think really, in terms of the mechanisms with psychedelics, we're really in the infancy of understanding exactly what is going on at what level. We're doing a study now with DMT to try and target, to get at that exact question, basically.
And so that DMT study, could you tell us a bit more about it? Because it's got a really interesting design. Am I right? It's the biggest DMT study to ever be done?
In this context, yeah. So it's looking at this reconsolidation mechanism again. I'm sure the audience of the podcast are largely familiar, but if they're not, then DMT is a very short-acting psychedelic. So unlike something like LSD or psilocybin, which will take hours if it's taken orally for the trip to stop, DMT, it kind of starts almost immediately after you start giving it to people and then stops just a few minutes after you stop giving it. Which again, we talked about the time efficiency thing before. Absolutely, yeah. It's going to be a hard sell convincing people to sit facilitating for 12 hours, I think, on the NHS. So we're aiming to do the same thing that we did with the ketamine, basically. Lots of people have suggested that a reconsolidation interference might be a way that psychedelics have these beneficial effects, but it's never been directly tested. And so we're doing a similar study and assessing, versus other drugs and placebo, whether DMT kind of interferes with this memory reconsolidation mechanism. And, we're hoping, let's say, the dream outcome, that it works really well. The outcomes are as good or better as with ketamine. Choosing between DMT and ketamine, well, it's good to have options. Some people might be more suitable for one versus the other, but generally DMT is a bit safer toxicologically. It doesn't have the potential dependence forming profile or the urological effects that ketamine has. So it might be the preferred option.
And so, Ravi, is this still in hazardous drinkers, just to check?
It
Yeah.
is,
Yeah,
just
yeah,
to
you're
clarify,
nodding.
yeah.
Just and so you're saying it's very similar to those ketamine studies. So will you not have any preparation therapy, or are you calling it preparation psychological support beforehand or integration after, or are you completely avoiding psychological support in this study?
No, so there is a minimum amount. We're trying to not do any other kind of formalized psychotherapy as much as possible, so that we can really isolate it to this mechanism. But from an ethical standpoint, obviously, we have to make sure people are prepared, because DMT can be pretty intense.
Yeah.
And are you recruiting naive participants as well, or do you have any requirements for your participants to have done other psychedelics previously?
We are recruiting naive participants as well, yeah. Yeah, so they will be eligible to take part in the study. We have an upper limit on psychedelic use,
Yeah.
no lower limit, which I think is important. I mean, maybe we can go into this later.
No, in fact, it's an interesting topic that gets discussed a lot in clinical trial designs, is the naivety of participants, especially in specific populations, which can be harder sometimes. But yeah, more about the study though, because it's a fascinating study. So are you able to tell us the other drugs that are on the other arms? Did you say that you're comparing it against other drugs as well, or is that being kept not in the public knowledge for now?
It is. So we're comparing it. There's this problem of active comparators in psychedelic studies. So everyone knows that they're on a psychedelic.
Yeah.
I mean, Ravi, just on that point, a placebo with a psychedelic, it's just not practical, is it? Real.
I agree with you, Joe. Yeah, people kind of tear their hair out about this stuff.
Terrible.
I think trying to come up with a blinding for DMT is a fool's errand.
Yeah.
But I think what is important is managing the disappointment effects that you might get in the placebo group.
Yeah.
And that's why we want other potentially useful active drugs. So we're using D-cycloserine, which we've used in alcohol studies before, which is a partial NMDA receptor agonist, and potentially enhances kind of synaptic plasticity in a way that you might expect a psychedelic to. And we're using a kind of non-psychoactive psychedelic called lyseride, which works via a similar receptor mechanism, but doesn't produce the florid trip.
Oh, that's very smart. Yeah, there's great comparators.
But I don't know if there's a right way to answer that question.
Oh.
I think some people just use it as a hammer to kind of try and beat any psychedelic studies. And it is an issue, and placebo effects, I think, are important, and nocebo effects are really important.
Yeah.
But we can, I think, measure them and get an idea of how much they are contributing to outcomes with some clever design approaches. And, in actual practice, obviously, everyone will know no one's double blind in the clinic, right? So, those efficacy estimates, I think, are still valid.
So what type of outcome measures are you going to be looking at? I know it looks very broad across cognition, behaviour, well-being, but what specifically are you assessing in those areas?
Yeah, we're looking really broadly, partly because, as we were talking about before, we don't know exactly what level change is happening on. So we want to kind of assess all the levels and see if we can piece together this puzzle of what's happening when, what change is driving what other change. So we've got brain scanning before, like a week before and a week after the dosing.
And what sort of brain scanning is it?
It's a pretty interesting paradigm, actually, that uses full-length movies.
Oh.
Yes, we've not heard about this really on the podcast, have we much, Joe? But it's really interesting. Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, the typical way that people look at brain connectivity is something called resting state, which is kind of what it sounds like, people just lying in a brain scanner.
Yeah.
Doing nothing. But obviously people don't do nothing when they're not stimulated, right? They think about cats or TikTok.
Their to-do list.
Yeah, the to-do
list. Sadly.
Or sometimes they fall asleep. And
in a scanner. I thought they were really noisy.
Well, they can be quite womb-like
But
and
There are a lot of
cozy.
people that tell me how relaxing it is as well. You kind of get the two spectrums.
But hang on, this isn't DMT in the scanner then?
No.
Because nobody's falling asleep then.
No, exactly. So a follow-up study to the one we're doing now, we will be dosing DMT in the scanner to look at the acute changes of the brain on DMT and see if we can kind of resolve that against the experience of it. But what we're interested in this study is more of the long-term, kind of like from a week or two beforehand to a week or two after dosing. Is there any evidence for this kind of long-lasting change in connectivity within the brain while people are watching movies? And so we use movies, A, to keep people awake, but B, because it's something that people would actually do, right? You actually watch movies, and it's a kind of much more ecologically valid way, I think, of assessing changes in connectivity. And it has the great benefit of that you know what people are watching when. So you're standardizing, you have an input, right? So you can resolve things. You can kind of tag different words in the film and see how the brain responds to words to do with alcohol or scenes depicting alcohol or more emotional scenes, and all these amazing analyses that you can do. And research has shown that using movie MRI, you can get much better prediction of behavioral and cognitive variables outside of the scanner than you do with just doing this resting state analysis.
What a great idea then. So how do you choose the film?
Yes.
I'm going to need to keep a little bit quiet about the exact films we're using.
Yeah.
Just because they need to not be seen, have been seen by the participants before and are part of our inclusion criteria. But so they're films that contain drinking specifically, so that we can look at the contrast between drinking scenes and non-drinking scenes and how people react to them. Yeah, otherwise I think they're just good films.
I can imagine the conversation choosing the film.
Yeah, in lab meeting.
Yeah, it was quite a fun conversation. People have very strong opinions, it turns out, about films.
And it's not the same film. Is it the same film before and after? People
will watch different movies, and that's because if people watch the same movie, you get a repetition effect.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we're hoping to look at what other brain changes using this paradigm, and then we've got a huge battery of questionnaires that kind of tap the different cognitive constructs that people have suggested might be what's happening when people benefit from psychedelics. So things like cognitive flexibility, things like openness, interoception. And we're going to, try and piece all of that together along with following up people using something called ecological momentary assessment, which is basically on like a smartphone app. So as people are going around their day-to-day, they will get little push notifications to complete a voice note or a little kind of journal. And we can look using kind of natural language processing models to see whether there are changes in the way people refer to themselves naturalistically in their language, and whether that predicts or is associated with changes in well-being and behaviour up to 9 months again with the follow-ups.
So that's a lot of data.
I think that, regardless of whether the study works exactly to plan or not, a big contribution of it is going to be the data, which we're, going to anonymise and make openly available to researchers once the study's complete to try and answer some of these questions.
Oh, great. So you're planning to make it like open access. Is that what you'd like to be able to do?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay,
yeah. We want people to be able to ask questions of the data once the study is complete.
Oh, fantastic. And just back to that app, is that the data coming from the information people are inputting? Is that going to help you look into the inner speech? Because I'm fascinated by inner speech. When I find out not everyone has an inner voice, I just can't get my head around it because my inner voice is always going. So, yeah, what are you particularly looking at with the effect of DMT on inner speech?
Yeah, so it's the notifications themselves are kind of what were you thinking about or what's going through your head over the last 20 seconds.
Oh, okay.
And so it's just, it's momentary. And there's research showing that people's language use and inner speech use changes or is at least associated with their mental health. So like the use of I terms increases with people's depressive symptomatology, like ruminating on themselves. And my co-PI, Jeremy Skipper, this is really his baby. I mean, he's a language neurobiologist. And the movie MRI paradigm is really his driving as well, so I can't take credit for the creativity there. But the hypothesis is that you'll see changes in language that are predictive of kind of subsequent, more general changes in well-being.
Okay. And then what about for the people who don't have an inner voice? Will you still just be picking up differences in maybe what they're putting into the app? Or is there anything that you're particularly interested for that specific population of people?
Yeah, I think it's relatively few, but on the app, we don't just collect inner speech data. It's momentary craving measures and mood measures. So we can track those things as well on the day-to-day.
Yeah, so I have a friend here who doesn't have an inner voice. And I read somewhere that psychedelics do give people that. And they give people that visual imagery that he doesn't have that at all. So
wow.
He can't visualize things or his family and stuff. It's extraordinary. Yeah. But he's never had it, so he's never kind of missed it.
That's an interesting question. I think it's something we've spoken about in our more speculative meetings. If you found a group of people with aphantasia and gave them psychedelics, what would they see?
Well, I'm really interested. Yeah, because I definitely read a study where a woman did then have that visual imagery after she'd taken a psychedelic, I think. Anyway, so if you are doing a study, we'll try and sign him up.
Absolutely. We'll just need to find some funding first, and that'll be the next one.
Yeah, there is that. Always that. But this is a complicated study, the one that you're running. And has that started? Have you started recruiting?
Yeah, we're recruiting. Yeah, it's a monster, Joe. Honestly, it's a lot of plates to be spinning. We've got an amazing team of people that have been working on it for a long time. So we're recruiting now, but honestly, we started the planning of this in kind of 2020, and things have taken that long. Funding come through and sorting out drug contracts, and then the pandemic didn't help. Honestly, it's only we've been recruiting now for a few months. So if people think that they might fit the bill for participating, they can find the kind of pre-screening information and the participant information on psychedelic.unit.com, and all the information about the study and the other studies that we're running is on there too.
And we'll put those in the show notes, won't we, Hannah?
Yes, definitely. And so other studies then, I saw that you've got a LSD imaging study coming up as well. And is that's not in hazardous drinkers? Is that in like a healthy volunteer population?
Yeah, so I'm less involved with that study. It's mainly being headed up by Jeremy, who I mentioned before, and Rob Leach at King's, but in collaboration with us here at UCL. Yeah, it's a healthy volunteer study looking more at mechanisms and brain effects of LSD specifically. So
that's an imaging study again, is it? Yeah.
It will be, yeah, in one of the fancy new 7 Tesla scanners.
Oh, very exciting.
Which will probably mean nothing to most people listening, but it's fancy.
Really expensive.
Really expensive.
And very fancy. And great resolution.
Great resolution, exactly. It's better for looking at kind of microstructural changes in the brain that you can't really see with a lower magnetic field. But that's, I guess, getting into the weeds a little bit.
We did. We had Mittal Mehta on the podcast, didn't we?
Yes.
And he did get into the weeds of imaging, which was helpful.
Good on Mittal.
Yeah. So actually, anyone wanting to get into the weeds of imaging, that's a good one to listen to, I think. Because it is hugely complicated. So, so you're obviously at the cutting edge of research. But and we've talked a little bit about NHS and bringing psychedelic therapy into the NHS. Clearly, there are loads of, I was going to say barriers, but that's maybe not the right word. I suppose issues maybe to be solved. How do you see it sort of panning out in the UK, I suppose, compared to the rest of the world, where, as we know, Australia has legalised, fairly restricted psychedelic therapy? Do you see that coming to the UK?
Yeah, it's really hard to forecast, I think, and particularly with where we are with psychedelic medicine currently. I think it's really easy to get stuck in kind of local echo chambers about how far we are along with the research. And obviously there are very outspoken proponents psychedelics who have very popular podcasts on the internet and can influence a huge number of people, and aren't always necessarily evidence based, but that that kind of public idea that they're these cure-all panaceas, miracle drugs, I think is a bit dangerous because they can't possibly live up to that hype. And we saw massive amounts of investment privately in a bit of a gold rush, I think, with psychedelics, and at such an early phase in the research, it's quite bonkers. And then I think what tends to happen is that you get more and more research and better controlled research and bigger studies, and you find the effects weren't quite as big as we thought initially, and then you get backpedaling, and I think we're kind of in a weird limbo place state at the moment with the research, but big studies are being done, and so I think we'll know a lot better what the roadmap forward looks like in 5 years' time. But it's really hard to predict where it's going to go. The States is another tricky one, where there are different state legislations and then obviously federal legislation. But now Robert Kennedy Jr. Very pro psychedelics and has come to destroy the NIHR and the FDA by the looks of it. So no idea how things are going to pan out there. But I think it's important to be a little bit careful about how we're selling the state of the field, particularly to people who might be desperate for better treatments.
Yeah, and there are many people out there.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's slightly unethical to sell this as a panacea to people who want hope more than anything, and are in quite a vulnerable position, or might just self-experiment without a kind of safe therapeutic environment. So I think we need to be a bit careful, but cautiously optimistic, I'd say.
Absolutely. And let's look at the data, and this type of study that you're doing, is going to give us an awful lot of information.
Yeah, we hope so. I mean, I know, speaking of, the echo chambers, from the other side, I know there are a lot of people in the research field who are a lot more skeptical about psychedelic studies, and I speak to a lot of them as well. And so there are definitely people to be convinced. The FDA, for instance, rejected Lykos's application from MDMA-assisted therapy. So they weren't convinced. And it's easy to think that everyone's on board with this, but a lot of people still think, what are you doing? Using drugs to try and, recreational drugs to try and treat people. So it's a weird tightrope to have to walk, to be honest, yeah.
And that's why it's important for psychedelic researchers to also get out of that echo chamber and to be going and presenting at different conferences, talking to psychiatrists, to people who maybe are more skeptical and do need to see the current evidence about to form their different opinions. I think, I can definitely resonate with being in an echo chamber.
Yeah,
Me too.
Yeah, it's easily done. It attracts people who are naturally inclined to think a certain way about psychedelics. If you're either doing research or participating in research, and coming back to the naivety thing, if studies have prior psychedelic use as an inclusion criterion, then there's a huge amount of selection bias in the people who take part in those studies anyway.
And then it'll be interesting to see when we get to that stage, if the drugs become licensed, when you have, I know the phrase often gets used, a dirtier population of people who will be trying the treatments, how then the treatments also perform in the real world. And that's where we often talk about the importance at that point for then collecting real world evidence as well. I don't think the research will not stop once it becomes licensed. I think it's really important that the research will continue, and that's when we can really work out who these treatments might be most effective for as well, and who they might not be.
Yeah, such a good point. I mean, think about SSRIs. It's we've had them for years, and there are hundreds and thousands of studies and meta-analyses on tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, and people still debate their efficacy. Yeah, so we're so far away from that, and I think there shouldn't be any exceptionalism for psychedelics, and I think there has been a bit, and I think they need to be held to the same rigorous standards of evidence as any other less zeitgeisty drug. Yeah,
no, that's very, very true, and that's where you come in. And Hannah, you're doing a trial as well, aren't you?
Yeah,
you're involved
at Imperial. So we're setting up currently in the process of getting regulatory approval for a psilocybin therapy trial for opioid use disorder. So looking really at early abstinence. So yeah, really important to be doing these trials to just build up that evidence base across different conditions.
Yeah, I sympathise, Anna. You don't really know until you've done it.
And as an animal researcher and former animal researcher, that was very straightforward. I mean, it was expensive and we had lots of regulations, but recruitment was pretty easy.
They always show up.
Very
They always
different
show up for their appointment. Rewarding them with food, they're usually pretty happy doing cognitive tasks and so on. But I just think on the other side, the flip side, I mean, yeah, we need to really understand much, much better how they work and who they're likely to work for and under what circumstances. But the use of psychedelics in indigenous populations for thousands of years, that's kind of quite special for us developing, it's not a new medicine, as I've just said, but, a new medication, I suppose, a new treatment. That's an interesting aspect of psychedelics, I think.
Yeah, agreed. There's a whole other kind of minefield, I guess, about how to tread this, appropriation of therapeutic cultures.
Yeah.
And, I am in no position to speak on any of that because my world frame is very much grounded within Western psychopharmacology education.
Yeah.
And I don't know. Yeah, it remains to be seen how much you can remove the drug from the context, right? And that's what we need to find out.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. And it is interesting that some, there are people like Simon Ruffle, who's a, Western psychiatrist, is spending a lot of time in the Amazon with the Shipibo people and learning as much as he can. And it's kind of training in a way to be a shaman. I like that he was saying the shamans are horrified that in the West we don't have a shaman, delivering the therapy. And we're a bit, worried that they don't have doctors or, medical trained. It's very interesting, I think.
Yeah, it makes complete sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's the cultural compatibility issue.
Yeah.
A shaman in the UK context might put people off. But obviously the reverse is absolutely true, of course, yeah.
And the other, Hannah, you were involved in the real world trial for medical cannabis with drug science, and that's another very interesting approach, I think, sort of real world evidence, because there are a lot of people using psychedelics, aren't there, or going on retreats. And so there is a lot of sort of data outside a clinical context that we could be taking advantage of, I think.
So I guess the most exciting opportunity for that really is looking at Australia and with the recent legislation change there, and really trying to collect real world evidence on the use of psilocybin there, as well as MDMA. So I think that really can open up a lot of doors for data. And then obviously elsewhere as well, I think we often forget about Switzerland, which has had prescribing going on for decades. And actually, as a result of that, there's amazing clinical guidelines that have come out of there, as well as lots of research as well. So I think it's going to be, I guess, like this kind of like multifaceted approach and bringing in like all your different types of evidence as the landscape changes to try and keep up with what's happening.
Yeah.
To try and build it as much as possible.
Yeah, it's pretty rare to be in a landscape where legislatively it's changing so quickly, and just how that will interact with research funding and use. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an interesting time to be researching psychedelics.
It really is. It's a great time to be doing it. And it feels like the funding has changed a bit in that there is better funding for the sorts of trials that you two are both running.
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak from my experience, but it wasn't an easy road getting the study funded by any means.
Can you say who's funding your study? Is it a government?
Yeah, so it's actually the Wellcome Trust, but a kind of US-based spin-out of the Wellcome Trust called Wellcome Leap.
Oh, okay.
And they fund specific programs with a specific aim that run for a very prescribed period and try and, unite researchers internationally who are doing complementary research to try and answer a specific question. So we're on a call called Untangling Addiction.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think I remember seeing that call, in fact. Yeah. How was it received at the time of like reviewers' comments when you were having the grant reviewed? Are you able to share any hesitations people had? 'Cause I think it's really interesting to think, if you're thinking about sometimes the counter argument people out there, what were the feedback like on the application?
From the welcome, it was great. And I think funders will often say that they're not scared of risk, but really they are scared of risk. UKRI is absolutely terrified of risk, frankly. But I feel like they really put their money where their mouth was with the leap. So they thought it was an exciting piece of research that had the potential to be, really impactful, and so they funded it. We'd proposed this project pretty much to several different funding bodies before, and been unsuccessful because, we got some unusual comments back. People not convinced of just using psychedelics per se, basically.
Yeah, you will get that prejudice, or is that the right word? A stigma? Yeah, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of it is luck of the draw and persistence, really. I think. I think as we come in full circle, like as we said at the beginning, it's an important thing to be appraised of in academia, is that you're going to have a lot of failures along with the successes.
Yes, you need resilience. A lot of
it.
Definitely.
Well, it's so good that you've got funding for this study.
Yeah, we're really happy. It's definitely made it a lot more achievable. And the timeline has also been compressed quite a lot, turns out.
Yeah.
Okay. How long have you got left of this study, Ravi?
So everything, the entire scheme, ceases to exist in July 27.
Okay, July 27.
So all of our 9-month follow-ups and data and everything have to be done by then.
And is that a 9-month in-study follow-up, so you have to...
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's particularly tough. a long follow-up in the study can make it really hard. Yeah, so it's going to be a tight turnaround.
Yeah, we're up against it. Yeah. So if anyone listening thinks that they might be eligible, you go to the site and fill out a screening form.
I mean, that's an interesting issue because recruitment is very tough because the criteria are very strict. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, but we've got to be safer than sorry at this point. And so we do, unfortunately, need to screen out a lot of things like current other mental health disorders, use of different pharmaceutical drugs, and, certain physiological conditions, like if people have got highly elevated blood pressure, those kind of things, which kind of does whittle down our potential pool of people. But they are out there. I think it's, it's just a case of trying to get people in as quickly as possible at the moment.
And so if you were looking forward then to July 2027?
That's right, yeah.
I know it's hard to predict, but what would be the result that you're most personally, just from your personal perspective, interested in coming out of the study? Is there any of those areas that you're most fascinated by?
So if we find that the DMT in combination with our memory reactivation procedure massively boosts reductions in alcohol drinking, that would be kind of the dream finding. I mean, kind of nihilistically, it would be not great from a clinical application perspective, but fascinating if there was a complete null result, right? So DMT was not superior to anything else when you have quite a controlled study, because that tells us the limits of what psychedelics, can achieve kind of by themselves. And then obviously we can explore variability within the people that we are recruiting. And so, maybe one of the most important contributions of this will be understanding what are the trait factors that predispose people to respond well to this.
Are you going to be looking at any specific, I know it's such a buzzword at the moment, biomarkers, but are you going to be looking at anything that essentially kind of makes someone stand out as a responder or not responder?
So only if you construe biomarkers pretty broadly to include the MRI data.
Okay.
Which you could, I guess, kind of a neural biomarker. Hopefully we can predict with decent accuracy who like behavioral change from the changes in the MRI data. That would be another kind of dream finding for us, which would help. And MRI isn't cheap, but it's becoming more available clinically. And so it's not unthinkable to think that it could be used for treatment personalization or profiling in the future. So that would be great as well. Yeah. But nothing specifically in terms of like blood-based biomarkers.
And this might be a naive question for myself. I had to recap the memory learning process before doing this podcast. Can you predict how people destabilize their memories? Are some people more susceptible to that? Or is there anything that would make someone have difficulties in that reconsolidation process?
You've hit on an absolutely key part.
I'm sorry. I don't know if it's my naivety or if there's a mechanism.
No, that's very insightful. So the other kind of more mechanistic track of research that I have is looking at what makes memories destabilize. And we have a lot of kind of healthy volunteer research trying to answer that exact question, because there does seem to be this kind of Goldilocks zone where the retrieval has to be just enough, but not too much. And and understanding where that lies, where the upper and lower bounds lie for each individual, is really difficult without knowing their entire history. And so we're trying to develop an EEG-based biomarker, if you will, to look at is there a measurable neural signature that can differentiate people just retrieving memories versus those memories being destabilized and interfered with.
Fascinating. And EEG would maybe be more scalable than MRI scans as well. I know that technology there is really growing at like a rapid rate.
Yes, that's what we were thinking. So there's amazing stuff coming. I mean, with the kind of proliferation of new machine learning approaches and like brain computer interface research with EEG, there's some pretty amazing stuff that you can do kind of online with EEG signals that we thought would be quite amenable to the kind of questions that we wanted to ask. And the scalability is the other one.
God, fascinating. Very, very excited to see these results. I think it's going to be, a very milestone study for people to look into.
I hope so. I'm excited to finish it too.
It's such an innovative study, isn't it? And, if it does work, it'll be extraordinarily beneficial in the long run, I think, for people.
Yeah, we hope so. I guess then the difficult question is what comes next. And I guess if it is very successful, then we have to apply again to do a big clinical trial.
And so that would be your next step. You would scale it up, would you, to be more of a clinical trial format?
I think that has to be it. Yeah. But we shall see. Watch this space.
Yeah.
Well, we are watching very closely.
Yeah. So that is the next question. And we're watching this space. Is there anything else you want to share with us, Ravi, that we should be looking out for from the Unity Lab?
You already mentioned the LSD study, which will definitely be very interesting. We've got another interesting study of people who are interested in psychedelics, particularly looking at preparation for psilocybin and how preparation can determine how people respond to it. But the other track of research that we've not really mentioned at all is nitrous oxide, which is kind of an unloved, undersung therapeutic drug, I think. So we've got, Sanjeev Kamboj, my kind of co-director of our unit, he's just got a huge grant to look at nitrous oxide as a potential intervention for PTSD.
Oh, wow. And how would that work?
So looking at a similar mechanism, so we've shown, I did a study using kind of a analog trauma, like using a really horrible film, basically.
Oh, yeah.
That people have these intrusive thoughts about because, ethical constraints on being able to actually traumatize people.
Mm.
And then if you give people nitrous oxide after, and a lot of people will have nitrous oxide as a painkiller in the UK after a traumatic event or during it, you get fewer intrusive memories of the film. And then there was an interesting study by a French group that showed that women who'd had complex births, if they'd had nitrous oxide as part of their pain management, they had lower incidence of PTSD subsequently. So it seems like if you can interfere with this memory stabilization process after a trauma, potentially you can reduce PTSD symptoms. And it might be that if you reactivate memories similarly to how we're doing with alcohol, you can achieve the same thing.
And nitrous oxide is so non-invasive.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Amazing.
Talk about scalability. It's already in every hospital.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And it's, easy, people can just breathe it. And then when they stop breathing it, it stops having its effects. It's so understudied, I think, as a potential therapeutic. I think ketamine's hogging the limelight.
It is. It really is. Yeah, yeah. So that's exciting. So he's kind of reinvigorating nitrous oxide research then.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's it's a really interesting set of studies that he's got planned.
Another one. So when will that read out? That'll be a while.
So this might be even later than us,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah,
So it's just in a setup phase at the moment, but a few years' time we will have some results.
Oh, great, Hannah! Very exciting.
So much to look forward to.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Wonderful.
Yeah, just need to skip forward a few years and we'll know.
They will fly by, definitely.
Yeah.
They will.
That's great. Well, thank you very much, Ravi, for coming on and talking to us all about these studies. It is an exciting time, I think.
Oh, no, thanks so much for the invite. Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. And yeah, it's really nice to be able to talk about what we're doing.
Thanks so much, Ravi. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you.